Okay, so if you're taking notes, right, you're adding a few of these things down to understand the British successes. All right, so top of page 92. We already talked about Braddock's success, or failures, okay? We're going to look at someone that has a little bit more success than Braddock in the colonies, okay? A guy by the name of James Wolfe we'll get to. We'll look at also why the British were so successful in defeating the French. And part of it became because of the guy, William Pitt. And so William Pitt's important is what? Why is he so important? What position did he hold? Yeah, he's a prime minister. So on this, he's equated to much similar to a president of the United States. Okay, so he gets elected, right? William Pitt gets elected, and he's passionate about defeating the French, right? He has a plan to defeat them, and he's going to switch some things up that are unusual for his time. But like the rest of the British people, and even the colonists, he could get them behind it because, again, they're wanting to expand. The British Empire is wanting to expand, and guess who's in their way? Well, it's the French. They hate the French, so they're going to have a good following. So William Pitt promises, right, to lead Britain, to lead the colonists in this kind of defeat against the French. Right, so the situation brightened for the British in 1757 when William Pitt became the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He said, "I am sure that I can save this country and that nobody else can." Pitt declared, although humility was not one of his strong points, he proved his good on his word. Pitt quickly adopted a plan to win the war. He decided to let his ally Prussia bear the brunt of the fighting in Europe. So he enlisted the help of Prussia, to fight his war in Europe. And so he was going to send troops, right, to the American colonies. Meanwhile, Britain used the superb navy to isolate the French forces in America and in India. Pitt also replaced the old incompetent commanders with young, energetic soldiers who led their army to victory. Pitt saw the British victory overseas could win an empire for Britain. So what are some of the changes in tactics that William Pitt is ensuing on this new war? What is he going to do to make sure that he has success? What is one thing he was going to do? Where's his focus? Yeah, Logan. Yeah, he's mixing it up, right? What's the issue? Well, we have these old incompetent leaders, right? They may have worked their way up, but they're not showing up, right? They're not winning. Okay, they're old. So let's get some youth in there, right? Right? There's energy behind these youthful guys, right? They may not know any better about war, right? They're excited about it though. Let's get the youth in there. So he's replacing these old incompetent leaders with young, smart, tactful, tactic-worthy young leaders, okay? So that's kind of one part to the British success, right? If you're taking notes, right, they added these successful, young, energetic leaders. What else did they do? How else did he make sure that he won this fight in America? Yeah.
He used his navy.
Yeah, Navy was huge, and you want to use the best resources you have, right? So you think of that in like terms of sports, right? And your team is up by 1 point, a few seconds left, right? You're going to use your best resources. You may not use your best basketball players, but your best resources might be the 7'2" guy on your team that can't shoot worth a darn, but he can sure stand up in front of someone with his arms and make sure a pass doesn't get in, right? They're using their best resources. Their navy happened to be their best resources, okay? They beat the Spanish Armada back in the 1600s, 15 and 1600s, and so they earned that right to control the waterways, right? They just had the better navy. What else did they do to focus on the Americas? Because, again, there was war happening in Europe. What did he do? Yeah, Laura.
Let Prussia take most of the fighting in Europe?
Yeah, so Prussia was going to be behind the events in the war in Europe. They were going to send British troops to North America. They're going to defeat their adversaries on multiple fronts, and so they needed to divide and conquer very well. And so that's one of those reasons to their success. Another major region was James Wolfe, okay? And so Jake's going to read the next paragraph about James Wolfe. The turnaround, this is the kind of like the inciting incident that changes everything. Go for it.
Among those new energetic commanders was General James Wolfe. With his thin body, receding chin, and upturned nose, Wolfe did not look like an inspiring commander. His military talents, however, were tremendous. In 1758, an army under his command captured Louisburg, still considered the most powerful fortress in North America. His victory gave Britain control of the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. The government then entrusted Wolfe with the key campaign of the war, the attack on the French-Canadian capital, Quebec.
Keep going.
Before the Quebec campaign, the British decided to capture Fort
Duquesne.
Duquesne and secure the forts of the Ohio. Learning from Braddock's mistakes, a larger, well-equipped force moved methodically from Philadelphia. Seeing such an overwhelming force approaching them, the French blew up their ammunition, burned their fort, and retreated. Visitors renamed the site Pittsburgh in honor of their prime minister. Only Quebec remained as the main center of French strength.
All right, so one of the commanders that he enlisted was James Wolfe. James, again, energetic. He took more people to fight at Fort Duquesne, right? And so he has a larger army. He understood the mistakes of Braddock. He brought more people that were better trained, and he defeated the French there in the frontier. Okay, so Fort Duquesne, that was a pain in their backside for quite some time. They couldn't beat it under Washington's leadership. They couldn't beat it under Braddock's leadership. Well, James Wolfe, they got it done under his leadership. Okay, and so that's where we get to see these youthful, right, leaders are leading them to victory. Youthful, energetic leaders are getting things done, right? Old people are just kind of in the way. Let's get it done with these youthful people. So the path to glory, what actually took place in Quebec? So Quebec, if you know, is in Canada. If you didn't, now you do, okay? Quebec's a city, a French city that was established in Canada. And the big part of James Wolfe's really success is that their Navy cut off their access to St. Lawrence River. And so when you look in your textbook, it kind of shows you the Great Lakes in certain maps, right, including that. But here on this world map here behind you, the way that the French would access some of their main cities, okay, in their, I guess, colonial territories in Canada, is they would go up around Nova Scotia right here, and around Newfoundland and Brunswick, and then there was this river that flowed, and much of their colonies existed there. So their navy cut off where they could get any sort of supplies, any sort of reinforcements, and that's kind of where we see the major part of the victory, is that their navy was able to cut off the French reinforcements. And we're going to look at how that took place in Quebec, which is a place that has a natural kind of defensible area, and we'll see how, again, the British win the war, or the major part of the war here in North America. Any volunteers to read the next section? The Paths of Glory. Laura, yeah, go for it.
The Quebec campaign of 1759 matched the two greatest commanders of the war, Montcalm and Wolfe. Montcalm knew that Quebec, high on a cliff above the St. Lawrence River, was a natural fortress. If the French could simply hold out against the enemy, the bitter Canadian winter would force the British to retreat. A determined Wolfe, however, devised a plan to capture the city. For several days in early September, British warships sailed up and down the St. Lawrence River, confusing the French about where they would land. Then, in the early morning of September 13th, a British force rowed to a point upstream from Quebec. As the boat glided across the dark waters, Wolfe relieved the tension by reciting to his officers Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. One line of that poem must have sounded ominous in their ears. The paths of glory led but to the grave. The soldiers landed, but soon the plains of Abraham next to Quebec swarmed with British redcoats. Deciding that he had to hit the British before they could reorganize, Montcalm launched his forces at the enemy. In the brief but decisive Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the British routed the French. Wolfe did not live to savor the victory. However, both he and Montcalm were mortally wounded. Quebec fell, as did Montreal the following year. The war in North America was over.
Okay, so the war was over before it finished in Europe. Okay. Yeah, so it carried over into Europe, right? It didn't get finished, and then in 1763 we see the agreement that takes place in Paris, the treaty. Okay, so we're going to look at kind of what did they decide on, right? How did this treaty that took place, and then they, I guess, define the terms of the treaty in Paris, how did this shape America to what it was at the time? So we're going to look at it. You can kind of get a glimpse here on page 93, where the French controlled, what lands did the French control, right? Where the Spanish controlled. And so the reason why we include Spain here is because Spain is whose ally in the French and Indian War? And in Europe? Who? British or the French? Come on, 50-50. French. They're the French, mainly because, right, the French had a hereditary, I guess, connection with the Spanish king, right, as we learned from the previous wars, right, the war of Spanish secession. So Spain and French, the French forces were united together, okay, in opposing the British, right, one of the allies. So we're going to look at, again, the terms that they decided on the Treaty of Paris. This is important to know, right? What did they ultimately decide and how to handle North America's and the French there? So the fighting in North America ended in 1760, but the war in Europe continued till 1763. Thus, the treaty took place in 1763. Dramatically changed the face of North America by removing the French influence as a major force in the continent. Eastern Canada and all territory of the Mississippi River went to Britain. Okay, so that's a key development. The Treaty of Paris is that pretty much all land east of the Mississippi, I'm going to put a dot there so I don't have to write out the whole word, went to British, the Brits. Okay. All land east of the Mississippi went to the British from the French, right? The French held territory went to the British. Okay, so the land that was originally the French, right, kind of claimed that land. They went up and down the Mississippi River, right, from Wisconsin. They had claims there, right? They had forts established there. After the Treaty of Paris, that belonged to the British. Okay? Major part, right? And then, so anything kind of west of the Mississippi that the English or the French had claimed was still theirs. Anyone remember the Louisiana Purchase? Anyone? Yes, right? The Louisiana Purchase. We bought the Louisiana Purchase from who?
Napoleon.
Napoleon, who was? French. Okay? So, in their dealings with Spain and France, Spain for a short time takes over land that the French had in the Louisiana Purchase. Okay? And then again, France then later takes that territory that's west of the Mississippi back from Spain. Okay, so for the victorious British, the cost of both war and the administration of the new possessions was high. The war had left a debt of over 140 million euros. In addition, the Parliament wanted to station 10,000 troops on the colonies to protect against the Indians at the cost of $350,000 a year. I forgot to mention, Spain temporarily lost Florida, but in return received all of France's Louisiana territory west of the Mississippi. So Spain, because they're allied with France during the French and Indian War and all the events that are happening in Europe, they were part of that treaty that took place, right? The Europeans that were fighting still had to negotiate with Prussia and Britain about how they're going to handle those things. So this is where we see Spanish held Florida is now in the hands of the British. Again, it's still that territory that was part of, right, the eastern part of the Mississippi. All that land went to the British. Okay? Again, it was a costly war, right? William Pitt didn't spare really any dimes on winning this war. And so this is where the issues arise between the British colonists and the British back overseas. Right? There's this massive amount of debt that incurred in this war. And then for another reason, they're going to leave their troops there, right? These British troops, at the price of $350,000 a year to what they say is protect against Indian attacks. Not surprisingly, the government that the colonies should share the expense, right? So they're saying, hey, you are going to share the expense of this war. In addition, King George III came to the throne in 1760. Who came to the throne in 1760? King George III. How do we know about King George III? Well, he is the king that lost the British colonies in the War of American Independence. Okay, so this is the issue here, right? He is trying to establish his dominance. King George III is trying to establish his dominance back in the colonies. However, the colonies for hundreds of years now were semi-independent, right? They had colonial laws. They really didn't need any oversight from the British crown. They had a charter saying that they could be there and establish their colony the way they want. And then now we see this British monarch putting his police in the colonies, charging us money for it, even though we never asked for it. He's going to start taxing us ridiculous amounts of things on various things to keep his control, right? And so that's going to frustrate the colonies because, again, they were semi-independent for quite some time now. He was messing with their affairs in the colonies. So the colonies, after almost a century and a half of semi-independence, resented the new attitude. Furthermore, some of the Americans suspected that the Redcoats were intended more to enforce government policies than guard against the Indian attacks. Skillful statesmen such as William Pitt might have been able to calm the colonies, but Pitt had resigned in 1761. The 22-year-old king and his circle of policymakers scarcely understood the growing troubles of the America and were therefore unable to resolve. So on page 94, right, if you haven't turned there yet, right, we can see visually what the British gained from the Treaty of Paris. Okay? All that land there is now British territory, right? It's written down. It is a defined boundary. Before that, they had ill-defined boundaries where both countries had laid claim to it. Now it's defined. It's written down in a treaty. And guess what? It's going to be exciting. The colonists can move west and not be afraid of Indian attacks. They don't have to be afraid of the French being there and killing them because that's technically their claim now, written down in the treaty. Right? So maybe that's why they got on board in fighting this French and Indian War in the first place, is that there was this promise to own land in places past the Appalachian Mountains. Right? What we're going to see later is that the British monarch and Parliament make a major mistake. And now after, again, gaining all this territory, they wouldn't allow their colonists to move past and set up colonies and set up towns past the Appalachian Mountains. So the question was, why did we fight in the French Indian War in the first place? Right? Why did some of our people die if we can't have access to the things that we fought for? Right? It's messed up. One positive result of the French and Indian War affected the future of history of North America. France in the 1700s were unbendingly and exclusively Roman Catholic. Great Britain, particularly in the colonies, was more tolerant Protestant. A French victory could well have led to a persecution of North American Protestants. However, the British victory of the North paved way for the future American religious freedoms in which faith, including Roman Catholicism, would share. So we look at the terms, and we can see that all the land east of the Mississippi went to the British, and that was given by the French. Okay, France gave that. Spain lost Florida in the deal, but they did gain the Louisiana Territory from the French. Okay, so there's now defined boundaries that these British have claimed to, right, and even up into Canada. Another result was, right, the natives, right? The natives were, in fact, a part of this French and Indian War, right? We have to look at what were some of the things that took place during the French and Indian War that affected the natives. Well, one last tremor remained from the French and Indian War. After the war, French army stopped fighting and went home, right? They just didn't have colonies there. They had forts there, they had claims there, but they didn't have colonies there, so they just went home. And so after they went home, as early as 1762, the brilliant Ottawa Indian named Pontiac, right? So we talked about Pontiacs yesterday. My first car, my first Pontiac vehicle, had formed a confederacy of Indian tribes. So this leader, Pontiac, formed this confederacy of Indian tribes. Again, because now they don't have the French for protection. So, enraged by the Treaty of Paris, Pontiac and his forces waged a devastating war against the British soldiers and settlers from 1763 to 1766. Who was supposed to be there to protect them? Who was supposed to be there to protect those settlers? They're paying $350,000. I would hope you would know, right? Who's supposed to be there? Right? They're paying $350,000 for these British soldiers to protect them from Native Americans. So why am I paying $350,000, right, if they're not doing what they're supposed to? If they're not protecting us. It's actually worse right now than it was before, right? So sometimes I have issues with Amazon, and they like promise that, hey, we can get your stuff here in 2 days, and then a week happens, and they're like, we're sorry, we can't control some of the processes. It's like, well, why am I paying for your subscription if you can't deliver or at least refund me for not having it here on time, right? You're paying for something and you're not getting it, right? So that's just stupid. Anyone feel me, right? They paid for something and they're not getting it. And so that's frustrating. It's frustrating to the colonists. It's like, we have a militia. We can handle this problem. Why do we need to pay for something we already have? And that's going to be a growing concern against the British involvement in the colonies. Eight of the Britain's 12 frontier forts fell to the Indians. Where are you? Right? Where are you? $350,000 is not paying for anything right now. Both soldiers and civilians were slain. Right? You're here to protect us. Pontiac, however, was unable to hold his confederacy together, and he eventually made peace with the British. 4 years later, after making peace with the British, Pontiac was killed while visiting a tribe in Cahokia, Illinois, which is across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis and near the site of the famous Indian Temple Mount. A young Indian warrior suddenly attacked Pontiac and clubbed him to death. The motive was never satisfactorily explained. Pontiac's success, however, raised serious questions in the minds of the colonists. What was the use of the costly British army if they could not even do their basic job? The French and Indian War settled matters between the British and the French, but it also created a host of new problems between the British and the colonies. So we are gearing up, right? We're seeing the issues that start to develop in the colonies because of the British lack of, I guess, control from the beginning, the lack of just know-how, and just the execution on the British side. So there's going to be a sense of identity that the colonists are going to come together and say, hey, we're better off without them there. Okay? And so the next section we're going to talk about is the sense of a nation rising in the colonies, right? At first, they're afraid of this colonial government that unites them together, but they're even more afraid of what the British monarch is doing. Okay? So that's the issues that they're going to run into here going on as we're seeing the development of the nation that is going to be the United States of America.